Our first talking guest today is John Mulholland. He's an Irish journalist, and he is the editor of The Observer. I suppose in terms of newspapers I've read over the years, I mean, The Observer is one of those papers that has always been kind of, I suppose, at the forefront of what I regard as quality journalism all through the years. And it's quite amazing to have you here in Dingle for a start. But it's also really interesting, going on the basis of what we were talking about yesterday with Lisa O'Carroll, to have you here as well. Maybe before we start, John, maybe just explain how you got from Ranelagh to the chair of the editor's chair, the corner office in The Observer.
Ryanair.
That's a good one.
Yeah. How did I get there? Well, I went to what's now called Dublin City University. It was then called NIHE.
Yeah.
Went and did a master's degree in Sacramento as part of that kind of degree course. Came back to Ireland in the teeth of the last really bitter recession, which was in 1985. And there really wasn't much doing. And I stayed in Ireland for about 3 months at that time and thought, I think I need to leave, because I'd been out of Ireland for 2 years. I'd been in sunny California, and coming back to Dublin on a day a little bit like today in Dingle, it just didn't feel like this was where I wanted to be. So I got an offer of it was just an interview for a job at the BBC about 3 months after I came back, and I thought, I probably got no chance of getting this job, but it's probably the point at which I decide I'm going to leave Dublin and move to London and see what happens. And then started writing for some Irish papers on a freelance basis, got a gig at a magazine that's since closed called City Limits, doing some radio reviews. And then once you get any kind of purchase on a position, you can then kind of leverage that. So I was radio editor of a tiny London magazine called City Limits. That allowed me to call The Guardian and say, I'm radio editor of City Limits. Can I do some stuff on a freelance basis? You know, they didn't know that I was spending about a day a week on the mag. Got into The Guardian, started writing bits and pieces. That lets you get into another position on another paper. So that, I mean, I just, I arrived in London. I mean, I don't want to sound like, you know, my dad, who had it really hard when he was growing up in Sligo, but I did arrive in London without very much. And I was working in a pub in Wembley for about a year alongside doing the freelance journalism. And, you know, it wasn't that much fun. Got smacked across the head one night by an Irish chap who had few too many pints of Guinness. Can't even remember why, but anyway, he didn't particularly take a shine to me at that point. So, you know, it was relatively rough. But I think if you have a passion and a determination and a commitment, it gets you a long, long way. You know, people always ask me, how do you get into journalism, or how do you get to the stage where you can be a success, whatever that means in journalism. And I never really go much beyond saying, if you have that kind of fire and spirit, it kind of It takes you an awful long way, and it kind of fires you, really.
Yeah. How long have you been editor?
5 years, almost to the day.
Right. Is this your first editorship?
Yeah,
apart
it
from
is.
Limits radio editor.
Yeah, deputy editor of The Observer before this.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like let's kind of hone in on one thing with that. The Guardian Media Group, the company which owns The Observer, the company who operates The Observer, has been very good at, and just the online presence.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems to me the Guardian has taken a couple of very strong, conscious decisions that no one else is really taking, or no one else is following on different lines. One of them is the US invasion, in inverted commas.
Yeah.
I go to South West every year, and at South West the last couple of years, the Guardian presence there is pretty special. Maybe talk a little bit about that, but also, I mean, from the Observer's point of view, what the online strategy is there.
Yeah. The online strategy of The Observer basically folds into The Guardian, to be honest, and obviously that's been a source of some heated debate, and the point, I think, being about specifically for The Observer that it's obviously a one-day-a-week publication, comes out 52 times a year. How can you build a presence online with a footprint that only appears once a week? And the argument within the organisation, whether I have always agreed with it or not, has been it's impossible to get purchase for a Sunday paper in an environment that happens every second, every hour, 24 hours a day. So leaving that diplomatically to one side, I mean, The Guardian clearly is in the vanguard of digital journalism, probably along with Associated, who own and publish the Daily Mail. The American operation is different in the sense that what they're trying to do, The Guardian, is they're trying to create journalism for Americans. It's not really about going into America and chucking a lot of journalism back at Britain or Europe. It's about creating a platform in America for Americans, and really, it's a commercial decision. It's a journalistic decision, but it's backed by a business plan which says if it doesn't work in 3 or 4 years, we'll have to reconsider. It's about getting more hits, it's about getting more reach, and it's ultimately about getting more money from advertising, because the American market absolutely dwarfs the UK and European market.
One thing the Guardian hasn't done today is a paywall. I mean, has that come up at editorial meetings? Has that come up for discussion? I like the smile.
It has come up for discussion, yeah. Funnily enough, it has. I suppose the thing to say...
Actually, no, I don't want to push you on the spot, but maybe just kind of pull back from that. And what paywall models have you seen that you actually like and you actually think work?
So, the New York Times, I think, is quite an interesting one, because they have a soft paywall, unlike the Times, which is a hard paywall. You're either in or out. You know, you're either outside the walled garden or inside. The New York Times have a slightly different model. It's called a soft paywall. You're allowed 20 free articles a month, and the assumption there being that you're going to find enough to graze on that you'd like to spend a little bit longer. I think that's quite interesting. But having said that, New York Times, completely different environment from The Guardian or any British newspaper. The New York Times is essentially in a one paper city. It competes maybe with the Wall Street Journal, but it's largely on its own. So what is its competitor set? It's completely different to The Guardian's competitor set. And particularly the problem for The Guardian, and I'm a massive fan of the BBC, absolutely committed fan that the BBC is something that improves the cultural life of Britain. But for newspapers, it's a real problem. It has a massive digital footprint, and it's doing some of the same sort of journalism that newspapers, and particularly The Guardian, would do. So the New York Times model, would that work? Would people go for some payment of The Guardian, or would they think, I'm getting some of this from the BBC? Clearly what you're not getting from the BBC is you're not getting partisan political analysis, because the BBC can't do that. So that's The Guardian's USP. But is it enough? Is it enough to make people pay? And that's a real problem for Alan Rusbridger, head of The Guardian, because he, like me, huge fan of the BBC, but recognises that it casts pretty big shadow over commercial news operations like ours. Yeah.
One thing I suppose we discussed yesterday with Lisa O'Carroll was, I suppose, the turn off, you know, at the point at which you stop the printing presses and you move to like an online only environment, or even, you know, in the case of The Guardian, a weekly only environment, which is good news for the Observer and good news for you, because it'll probably be on a Sunday when you're going to publish. Like, have those, I know, say, inside the newspaper I work for, the Irish Times, those discussions are there, and there's a lot of kind of kicking the can down the road. Do you think, you know, that media organisations in many ways are afraid to kind of grasp that nettle and realise that the model is changing? Or is it the case that the evangelists for change in the organisation aren't really being listened to?
No, I don't think it is. I mean, this isn't something that we're afraid to deal with or analyse. We probably look at it every year and look at it in real detail. If we thought that commercially the best thing for us to do at the moment was to switch off some part of the news operation, that's what we would do. But that's not the case at the moment. I mean, it's a question of weighing up the sources of revenue that you have. And, I mean, this is the difficult bit. Newspapers are extremely costly to produce, because you're in this bizarre position in 2012 where from midnight to 4 a.m. or 6 a.m. you're trying to get this newspaper out to 55,000 shops in Britain every day. I mean, that's ridiculous in 2012. It just seems like a ludicrously antiquated system. So that is an incredibly costly thing to do. On the other hand, revenues from newspapers account for 65% of all the revenues into The Guardian and Observer. So that's the difficulty. They carry most of the cost, but they also carry the overwhelming bulk of revenue for us. And we can't turn our back on that revenue. We would be in an even worse position at the moment. But, you know, we watch it every year, and there will probably come a point where that relationship between cost and revenue changes, and we're carrying 60% of the cost on the newspapers, but we're only getting 30% of the revenue. But at the moment, it's as high as 65%. So we have to run both operations in parallel for the time being.
Yeah. Was it a hard decision to make, to close down the Sports Monthly, the Music Monthly, the Women's Monthly? I mean, they were like, you know, you put a lot. The Observer put a lot of investment, both of resources and money, marketing muscle as well, into those supplements. They ran for a couple of years, and it must have been a hard decision.
Yeah, it was pretty brutal, especially as
actually brutal is the word I should have used.
Deputy editor, had actually, without blowing my own trumpet, I completely conceived the sports magazine, the music magazine, and the food magazine, which we retained. I mean, literally from a blank sheet of paper. That's what I, as a journalist, had done. I recruited I edited the first couple of issues of each of those and then recruited the editors. So closing those down was absolutely horrific, because we also had to lose very, very good journalists who were working on them. I mean, the calculation that I had to make was the company was saying to us, the Observer doesn't work at the moment. Commercially, it doesn't work. And we had a reasonably well publicized discussion, I think is the word we'll use here, within the company about what to do with the Observer. And I was absolutely committed to making a case for the Observer still having a role to play in the company commercially, and not journalistically, because I knew I was only going to win this if it was about a commercial argument. And after I made that case, we ran the sums, we did the work, and we found a way that the Observer could actually work commercially, but it would only work if we took a lot of costs out. That meant closing those magazines. So I had to kind of level with the staff to say, look, this isn't easy, but it's not really about me and it's not about you. It's about a 220-year-old newspaper, and mostly it's about the readers of the paper. So we have to kind of overcome our own personal feelings of injustice or hardship or whatever, and do what is right for this paper and its readers. And that's what we did. We took £3.5 million out of the cost of the Observer and placed it commercially in a healthy position, which took the question mark away from its existence within the organisation.
You mentioned there about 220-year history, and right now in all newspapers, I suppose that kind of church and state divide that used to exist between the kind of like administration, marketing side of the house and the editorial side of the house, that kind of wall is being slowly chipped away at. I mean, obviously there's always been financial pressure on newspapers to perform, to sell, they need the money. Printing presses don't grow on trees. But if you look back at that 220-year history, do you ever kind of wish to yourself, I wish I was back in those days? I wish, instead of being at the long line of Observer editors, you were kind of back in the middle.
Yeah, I think about that almost every day. And I do think about that every day, and probably every hour. I mean, I think, in fact, of the 10 years that I had as deputy editor of the Observer, from 1998 to 2008, which were basically the salad days of the last salad days for journalism, in a sense, because it was during those 8 or 9 years that we launched 4 monthly magazines. It was during those 10 years when we had, marketing spends that I could only dream of, and even then I probably wouldn't get to them. It was a time when the economy, for good or ill, was overheating, and we were making fantastic sums of money in advertising revenue. So I don't even have to go back 100 years or 50 years. I only have to go back about 5 years, which some people might say is unfortunate, because that coincides precisely with my coming into the editor of the
The global recession is not your fault, John.
The precision timing is not my strong point either, no. So, it's not that long ago. I mean, previous to that, the Observer's always had problems, but it was oftentimes owned by a benevolent owner, a single individual of the type that now owns the Independent. But, the commercial pressures really happened in and around 2007, when the world economy basically came off a cliff, and that was happening at the same time as all those ferocious pressures from digital media were crowding in on us and creating news platforms that were free. So it was a double whammy. Even if the world economy had never slowed down, news organizations in Britain and Europe were going to have their own little localized recession because of all of the factors we know about digital obstruction.
The thing about ownership, John, there's I suppose here in Ireland we've got Dennis O'Brien taking over the Independent Group. Irish Times exists as a trust, and we've all the various tabloids with kind of like the UK ownership placed in place. Do you think with the Guardian Media Group owning the Observer that it's safe? You're safe, or is it a case that that the next time the bean counters come around, they won't be going after the Sports Monthly? They might actually go after the whole newspaper.
That's a very good question, Jim.
I never like when someone says that to me. It means two things. It means one.
I'm very clear. Alan, the head of the Observer, has been incredibly supportive of the Observer recently. He may have had question marks about it 2 or 3 years ago in terms of what its commercial benefit to the company was. The commercial benefit to the company at the moment is absolutely clear, and in a sense, because I made that, as it were, agreement with the company 3 years ago and said, look, if I can convince you that there is a commercial position where the Observer contributes to the company, I'm in the clear, right? Yes, you're in the clear. So, I mean, I've, in a sense, made that agreement. And the point at which the Observer continues over a period of time to be a drain on the parent company, then there's going to be problems for the Observer. I mean, but I accept that. I mean, the Guardian is all about the daily newspaper, and the Trust only bought the Observer 20 years ago. It is committed to preserving Guardian journalism in perpetuity. That protection doesn't extend to the Observer, and I'm completely clear that that is the case. The Scott Trust is a trust that's set up with its own constitution, and its constitution is there to protect the Guardian. It doesn't extend to the Observer, and so our position is that we have to do everything we can to make the case for the Observer, both journalistically and commercially. And although I have to spend a lot of time making sure that the numbers add up, I spend much more time making sure that the journalism adds up, because that's the public face that people see. The commercial stuff, that's something that we have to deal with privately.
I don't think there's any Observer journalists here today, bar yourself. So maybe you can tell me what your favourite parts of the newspaper. There's no one going to hold it against you.
Nobody's
and
going
no
to
one's
hold.
tweeting from here.
No, nobody's tweeting. No, it's a Chatham House rules.
Yeah, totally Chatham House rules. Actually, if any solicitors or even legal students here, just get out as well.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I don't have a favourite part of the paper. I mean, we don't. It's not a terribly big paper. It's a 4-section paper, 5 when the Observer Food magazine appears. I think all of them contribute to what you want the Observer to be, which is a bright, sparky, edgy, fun, liberal paper. I mean, you know, I suppose if I was pushed, what I would say is there's lots of journalism that we do on the Observer, which is repeated to some degree by other papers, whether that's say arts coverage, sports coverage. You know, pretty much everybody does that, and I like to think that our critics are better than competing Sunday papers, but that isn't what distinguishes what the Observer is about. I think what distinguishes what the Observer is about is its political commentary, its political analysis, its economic analysis, its robust reporting about injustice, its attempt to try and shed light on dark places across the world, its foreign reporting. It's the sense that the paper wants to make a difference, that the paper matters, that there's a spirit and drive behind the paper which is about something other than just entertaining people, which is a perfectly reasonable and proper part of journalism. But there has to be within its DNA a sense that it is trying to protect people who need protection, giving voice to people who don't have a voice, and as I said, shedding a light in kind of dark places. I mean, for me, that's what I get out of bed for, really.
Yeah. But you said there, John, about the fact that your aim is kind of to make sure you're getting the best product journalistically out there, the best kind of paper out. Would I be right in thinking, I remember reading Max Hastings' book on his time as the Daily Telegraph editor, great read, and like it seemed that most of his work on a day-to-day basis was kind of all like put up with fighting battles with administration, fighting battles over kind of money. Is that, would you kind of concur with that?
Yeah, I mean, you do. There's a book written by an ex-deputy editor of The Observer, and this was quite a while ago, maybe 40, 50 years ago, but he said the journalism is the bit you do in between all the meetings. And there is some truth in that. I mean, you do spend an awful lot of time not doing journalism. But my view is, as editor, I have to facilitate a place where other people can go and do really good journalism. And I've got to be a buffer for them. They don't need to know about the kind of things that I'm going to have to discuss about reducing the editorial budget or whatever slightly difficult situations are pressed on us. So what I have to do is create a good collaborative work environment for people to do their best work. And if that means me having to go to interminable meetings about this sort of strategy or this marketing plan, or then that's what I'll do, because it creates a fertile ground for other people to do their best. And I do create enough space around that to intervene quite heavily in the journalism. I mean, I'll have a big footprint in the review section, a big footprint in the news section, and quite a big footprint in the magazine. And you know, I will always make clear to people that we have to do some journalism along the lines of what I spoke about journalism that makes some impact on our world and tries to make it a slightly better place. I mean, I really do feel that if we're not doing that, you kind of have to fold up your tent and take off.
I mean, what stories would you have covered? Would the paper have covered in the last while that you'd be most proud of? On that score, on that score of uncovering stories that no one else is kind of doing, especially on the kind of social justice stories.
Well, I think we've done a lot. I mean, it's not an individual story, but it's a series of pieces across a couple of years that we've chipped away at. We've done a great deal of work around sex trafficking and the impact that sex trafficking has, particularly on women in Britain. And we have, lifted the veil on the fact that Britain is a place where there are women working in appalling conditions. They've been trafficked from Africa and Eastern Europe. And, it's quite bizarre to think in 2012 there are women who are basically sexually imprisoned in brothels across Britain. I mean, that's just grotesque that that's happening in 2012. And we've got a piece in the paper today which, in fact, touches on that. But we have run pieces by an award-winning journalist called Mark Townsend, who has spoken to women here in Britain who have been trafficked from abroad. We've gone back to their home places in Eastern Europe to talk about the way that happens. That's one. We're currently doing a series about the working poor in Britain and how difficult it is for people who are just on the edge of a financial cliff and often in danger of falling off it. We've done a lot about so-called ethical tourism and the impact that has on indigenous communities in Asia and South America. And we're currently doing quite a lot of work around a blacklist of workers that was in operation. Again, bizarre to think that as recently as some years ago, there was a blacklist operated by big building firms who didn't want to take on union activists who are trying to ensure that health and safety issues on building sites were being observed. And this blacklist was in operation during the building of the Olympic Stadium. It was and is in operation during the building of the Crossrail transport system in Britain, in London at the moment. So again, kind of weird to think that a almost McCarthyite practice of banning somebody from working because their political persuasion is operational in Britain, particularly when they were being banned for trying to make sure that health and safety was observed. And you think, it's pretty important that health and safety is observed on a building site. So those are just some of the kind of stories that I think are ones that we keep returning to and try and kind of raise awareness on.
I suppose, we talked yesterday with Lisa about like Levinson inquiry report and that. And before we get on to that, I mean, one interesting kind of, I suppose, observation from a journalist who looks at kind of like English journalists and English editors. What's your level of access like in terms of 10 Downing Street, in terms of House of Commons, House of Parliament? Are you like when you read kind of memoirs of editors, you're seeing about all these access stuff? Is it as kind of cozy as it's made out to be, or is it totally different from your point of view?
I mean, I wouldn't say it's cozy. I think it is quite proper that prime ministers meet with some senior journalists in the same way that they meet with senior law figures, that they meet with senior members of the medical profession, they meet with senior members of business. I mean, they're running a country and they're taking soundings on a whole range of issues. The difficulty was that in some cases, probably, there were journalists who got too close to politicians. I think certainly the relations that I have had with senior politicians in Britain are very businesslike. You go into the meeting, it's not like you're going to sit around and have a few pints. They're very formal. You go in with a list of questions that you want to try and get answered. And of course, what they're doing is, they're selling a product, they're selling their policies, and it doesn't stop you coming out the next Sunday and writing a piece which is possibly, as critical as it would have been, if not more so, than before the meeting happened. So I think, by and large, the relations that editors have with politicians are completely proper. There are a lot of other contacts that happen with political correspondents, political editors, And again, I mean, I think by and large they are characterized by a properly professional approach to doing what they should be doing, which is finding stuff out. I mean, that's what we want people in news organizations to be doing, and preferably finding stuff out that politicians would rather wasn't known.
Mm. Has your impression of David Cameron changed since he became Prime Minister?
Yeah, well, I mean, he came to. I mean, I suppose the difficulty for him was that he spent 5 years preparing to be Prime Minister. And for 3 of those years, it was a time when the economic climate was completely different. So he was allowed, and he had the space to create an impression that he was going to be an evangelist for green issues, that he'd be liberal on social issues. You know, it wasn't a time when people were thinking that the kind of economic issues were going to crowd in on him. He became Prime Minister, and suddenly people weren't really that interested in climate change anymore. People were interested in getting the deficit down. So he has changed in the sense that he didn't deliver what maybe was expected, but equally the environment in which he came to power was completely different to the one that he had thought at the time. You know, when he went up to the Antarctic or whatever it was and posed with the old Huskies, you know, that was probably quite a good trick at the time. It proved not to be that relevant to the political discussion that was taking place when he became Prime Minister.
I mean, there's also maybe a case as well that those tactics don't work anymore. That, like, I mean, I think that the public may have become a bit more wiser to that kind of thing.
I don't know. I think they probably do. Actually.
They like the Penguins. Okay, they like the Penguins.
They like the Huskies. Yeah, they like the Huskies. I mean, I think there's an argument for saying that Ed Miliband probably ought to have done a couple more of those, to be honest, because I think there is a sense in which people aren't quite sure what Ed Miliband is about, and without being cynical about it, two or three well-placed sort of stunts can register with viewers and voters in a way that long exchanges in the House of Parliament probably don't. So
yeah, he came across quite wonky in the last interview you carried. There was a 2-page interview, and I remember reading it, kind of going like,
I'll tell him you said that. He'd be pleased about that.
Okay. Well, no, he did. There's no personality from
yeah.
it, you know?
Yeah, no personality. That's quite a big.
Okay, I don't have a vote in the next UK
No.
general election, so he's at least looking.
No, I know you're right. I mean, he everybody around Ed Miliband knows that he does come across as being a bit geeky and other words which are associated with geekiness, which are a bit stronger, but which I won't mention. But no, I mean, he does. He has a problem. He's not as warm as cuddlyable as some of those who've gone before him. He doesn't. I mean, some people would say that when it comes to sort of social skills, you know, he's a few sandwiches short of the full picnic on that front. I think that's harsh.
Do you say that about Andy Kenny as well? Then he went out and just shook hands with everyone.
Yeah. No, I think that, but it's true. He doesn't have a kind of ease of communication with people that some others do, and that's something he's going to have to try and conquer, I think.
I mean, that whole idea, let's maybe stay a bit on this, on like political traits, that whole idea of being personable and being, I hate to use the word cuddly, but like, you know, being approachable in that kind of way, Tony Blair was a master of that in many ways.
Yeah, he was, and even much more recently than that. I mean, he's now become, you know, sort of public hate figure number one, but up to the point where he got into government, Nick Clegg was talked about as somebody who was the most normal of all the political leaders in Britain. He was a guy who you could kind of see sitting down, having a chat about different issues. He didn't appear to be spun. He appeared to have a sort of normal relationship at home. He liked going to Spain. He liked playing with the kids. And it didn't do him a lot of good. You know, once he got into the kind of hard arena of political knocks, he was taken down just as a less cuddlyable version would have been. But so I'm not sure in the long run how useful it is actually.
Moving back to the Levinson inquiry and the report that issued last week, John, I mean, as an editor of a UK national newspaper, you know, what were your initial impressions? Did it come out in the wash the way you thought it came out? Were you disappointed by Levinson? I asked Lisa yesterday, did you think he chickened out? She didn't think he did.
No, I think it was a pretty good report, actually. I think it was pretty sophisticated. I think it was pretty intelligent. If anything, it was softer than we might have expected in the press. Maybe that was what Lisa meant by saying he chickened out. But equally, he was playing a political game. He wanted to create a report whose recommendations would be accepted by Cameron. He always said from the very outset that he didn't want his report to suffer the same fate as the 7 previous reports on the press over the last 80 years, none of which were adopted in any form by any of the sitting prime ministers. He didn't want his report to be kicked into the long grass. Sadly for him, 2 hours after it was published, it was kicked into the long grass. But his report was relatively soft in terms of what it suggested, and I think was relatively soft because he was hoping that it would probably have been accepted by all of the leading political parties. Yeah. So I mean, it's a 2,000-page report. There's an awful lot of detail in it. There's a lot of broad brush characterization of it, and people have taken very partisan positions. I think the truth is somewhere between the two extremes, which is that there is an awful lot of very good stuff in that report, and in the kind of fiery political climate that we have, things get reduced to sound bites, and it looks as though both parties are a long way apart. I'm not sure that they are, actually. There's a centre ground that I think we might move to over the coming weeks and months.
Like, in terms of ramifications for media organisations, Nick Davis from The Guardian was the fore in kind of bringing this story out in the first place. Do you think in some ways that, Lisa, again, yesterday we were talking about investigative journalism and the fact that would this make people more risk averse, Do you think, that is journalism kind of always going to have to take risks in that kind of way, and it's going to have to kind of I suppose sometimes play the man rather than play the ball?
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, we ran a leader last week which basically said, look, people will get stuff wrong sometimes, but maybe the price of a properly free press is that we do get some stuff wrong, but that we get an awful lot of stuff right. And I think people would accept that bargain if we didn't get quite as much wrong, and also that we didn't get the stuff, the sort of stuff that we've been getting wrong. I mean, if we get some stuff wrong around the kind of edges that's not that important, I think the public will accept that. I think the scale of the errors that some of the press have made over the last 10 years suggests that we really do have to clean up our act really seriously, and I think we have to convince a very sceptical public. There was a call-in this morning on BBC Radio, which somebody told me about, and they said that the tone of the public on that call-in was really hostile to the press. It recognises just some of the hardships that it's created over the last 10 years, and sometimes that view is not articulated in a press because the press is evidently going to work in its own self-interest, which is to thrash those bits of the Leveson report which they're not supportive of. And the danger, I think, is that the press as a whole is out of step with a public opinion which, after all, considers journalists somewhere on a scale, just below estate agents and just above politicians. So, we haven't got a fabulous reputation, and to go on the front foot,
we're scum.
I think we just have to recognise that. I mean, the press has cause to be, I think, a little bit more humble in the way it approaches the Leveson report than it has been.
But humility is not a quality we have.
It's not a quality some of us have, Jim.
Okay, moving swiftly along. As an Irishman, in the chair once occupied by Astor, and once given that 220-year history of the Observer, and the Observer, through Henry MacDonald, has a very good Irish correspondence side, through Lisa as well, through the stories. What are your kind of thoughts and opinions on how Ireland is perceived abroad right now? Are we seeing as a basket case up there with Greece? Does the horrible story from Galway, does that kind of cast shadows as well?
Okay, I don't think Ireland is seen as a basket case like Greece. I mean, if there is a narrative about Ireland now, the narrative is this is a country that was laid low by politicians, by planners, by private business, and that they are doing their level best to take the medicine, plucky, supplicant Irish, not anywhere near as hot-headed as those febrile Southern Europeans who like to take out to the streets and throw some kind of, whatever rocks. I think there's a feeling that, whether it's patronising or not, there is a general sense that Ireland, more so than Portugal or Greece or Spain, have attempted to get to grips with the financial calamity that was visited on them. whether that pays due attention to the hardships that's visited on many people in Ireland or not. And, I've got lots of family and brothers and sisters in Ireland, and a couple of them teachers, and I know how difficult it has been for civil servants in Ireland as one group who've had to kind of take a hit. So, the level of detail in reporting from the UK of Ireland it's going to be quite broad brush. But if there is a simple characteristic, it's bad things happened, and Ireland is probably doing better than most to try and get out of it. But it's interesting because you almost always write stories in headlines about countries, and for 15 years in the 70s and 80s it was Ireland is a troubled place with guns and bombs. Then we had a 10-year period when the Celtic Tiger was riding around and purposefully and powerfully, and Christ, there was loads of shit written at that time saying Ireland is an absolute economic miracle. And there weren't many journalists, to be honest, saying in Britain or elsewhere, let's look behind the economic miracle. So I'm always a little bit skeptical of, stories that are written in that kind of headline ease, because they're a little bit too simplistic and they characterize a situation which is incredibly detailed and complicated. And it's, I think, a function of some journalists to try and tease out something which is a little bit more sophisticated than that.
What about, the narrative, I suppose, the journal narrative, when the story breaks about Savita in Galway and that the whole abortion debate, 20 years on, is suddenly back in the frame. And in this particular case, Kitty Holland's story was amplified worldwide thanks to social media. It was all over the place within hours. Yeah. So that suddenly became a story. Ireland is no longer the basket case of Europe, blah, blah, but suddenly you've got this story bringing it back to 20 years ago. What?
Yeah, that's kind of case in point, because there's a lot of coverage of the Savita case when it happened 3 or so weeks ago, and it was, Christ, I really didn't think that Ireland was still kind of carrying on in these medieval ways in its attitude to women. And what we haven't done properly is revisit the debate in the last 2 weeks to say, actually, there may well be a change of opinion in Ireland as a result of that case. It may be that previously MPs who held fairly right-wing views on social issues are having a change of mind. So that's a case in point that we wrote all the kind of graphic headlines of what that grotesque situation that happened in Galway 3 weeks ago, and we now have an obligation to go back, not just dip in for 24 hours, write the headline and get out, but to go back to see what impact that had. And insofar as I can tell, what is happening is that it's causing a debate about abortion legislation, which is taking place in a different sort of environment to the ones that happened 20 or 30 years ago. So, the case in point, we've got an obligation to go back and see what impact it happens. A little bit after the actual story kind of blows up. But
for a story like that, it requires resources, it requires an investment. Sometimes maybe it's a case of your readers may be interested in the initial kind of burst of, in many ways, maybe confirming prejudice they might have about Ireland, and they want to move on.
Yeah, I think there's no excuse for papers in Britain not to cover Ireland pretty well, given that it's so close and it doesn't take much to get at that story. I guess there's probably a sense in which there aren't that many new things to say about Ireland, because the overarching narrative, I said, has been about an economic story, and that story has been kind of done. It may well be that the legacy of what happened to Savita is that we open up a different discussion about Ireland, which is not about economic issues, but is about social issues and cultural issues.
You said there, there's no excuse for an English papers not to cover Ireland. Were you surprised to hear that RT closed down their London office?
Yes, I was. But, on the other hand, every single news organisation in the world has closed foreign bureaus in the last 10 years. Seems to me peculiar that, given the amount of kind of cultural and political and economic trade between the two islands, that they would choose to close that one. But I don't know enough about the detail of RT's balance sheet to know why they chose that decision. They may well think that they can cover London or Britain very well through a network of stringers or freelance journalists. I don't know.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much for your time. And final question, John. What's next for you? What do you want to do next? And don't say stay in the same job for 5 years. Do you have ambitions beyond the Astor chair?
Well, I think not getting fired is always a good ambition. I think that keeps my mind concentrated. I've been doing it for 5 years. No, I'm pretty happy to do it for a little longer. there's frustrations and there's difficulties, and it's a nightmare time to be doing this job because of all of the reasons that everybody knows about. And yet it's more than compensated for by knowing that you can have a material impact by doing some decent journalism. Just a tiny case in point. A couple of weeks ago, we ran a piece about a cleaner who used to clean the halls of the corridors of power, literally. He cleaned the Deputy Prime Minister's office, Nick Clegg, and he worked for a contract firm. And people who work for contract firms don't have any pensions, they don't have any entitlements, they can be sacked at a minute's notice. He was being paid the minimum wage, and he was becoming the public face of a campaign to introduce the living wage to people who clean in Whitehall. When there was some publicity around him 6 months ago, the company that employed him moved him out of Whitehall and put him in a much more difficult work environment where he had to travel much longer, and it made his life a nightmare. And that wasn't very well publicised. We did a piece 3 weeks ago on him saying, why was this guy who was cleaning the Deputy Prime Minister's office punished for raising the issue of the living wage? The difference between the minimum and the living wage is about £2. Makes a difference between people like him having to go to payday loan sharks and paying astronomical interest rates on £50. We did a big piece, and as I was reading the piece, I said to our political editor, get hold of Clegg and get a quote in the piece where Clegg says everybody has a right to campaign for the living wage. Nobody should be penalised for it. And Nick Clegg's office gave us a quote. We ran a big piece of Valdemar's from Portugal, and we heard a couple of days later that the firm were going to make him Employee of the Month. And that's just a one tiny way that hopefully we will have a tiny impact on one person's life. And if we can kind of multiply that out, then what keeps me in my job is thinking that, without coming over like sort of Jesus Christ, but we do try and make life a little bit better for a small number of people.
Cool. Thank you very much, John. That was brilliant.